Welcome to the 12th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. Connection to the public Wi-Fi is available for tweeting questions. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And now welcome Provost Dr. Prabhat Hajela.
Good afternoon. I'm Prabhat Hajela, Provost at Rensselaer, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 12th Annual President's Commencement Colloquy. The Commencement Colloquy was established by President Jackson in 2003 to provide a forum for the Rensselaer community to gather on the eve of commencement for a dialogue with our honorands. Please join me in welcoming the host for today's colloquy, the 18th President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson.
Good afternoon. It is with great pride that I welcome our 2014 graduates, their families, and all members of the Rensselaer community and the larger community here with us this afternoon, and all who are watching online. This colloquy, perhaps unique to Rensselaer, has become an integral part of our commencement exercises. It is a valuable opportunity to hear from our extraordinary honorary degree recipients. We are grateful that they and you have taken the time to be with us today. I must tell you that we are in for a treat. Big data, broad data, high-performance computing, data analytics, cognitive computing, and web science are creating a significant transformation in the way we make connections, make discoveries, make decisions, make products, and ultimately make progress. Indeed, data is the new natural resource of the 21st century. Now, here at Rensselaer, we are engaged in an institute-wide effort to maximize the capabilities of these tools and technologies to expedite scientific discovery and technological innovation, to develop the next generation of digital enablers, and to prepare our students to succeed and lead in this new data-driven world. Throughout the Institute, including through the Rensselaer Institute for Data Exploration and Applications, or the Rensselaer IDEA, we are fostering collaborations across disciplines, sectors, cultures, and countries to harness the power of big data for the urgent purpose of developing answers to the intersecting challenges of energy, food, water, health, and national security, climate change, and the allocation of scarce natural resources, all fundamental to our daily lives and to the long-term viability of the planet. Being data-driven is not new to Rensselaer, and in fact is part of our history, our culture, because our founder, Amos Eaton, a botanist and geologist, was a zealous collector and analyzer of data. He also was an important innovator in scientific education, insisting that Rensselaer students learn by doing, by collecting data in the field, by experimenting in the laboratory, and by preparing lectures for their peers and professors. In other words, he pioneered the studio classroom approach we still use here today, and he certainly believed in data-driven discovery and innovation. The members of the Rensselaer class of 2014, regardless of their particular area of study and focus, will be among those leading a fundamental shift that is underway globally, powered by this deluge of data. Our 2014 honorary degree recipients have enabled and enriched this data-driven era. Each has created clarity in the midst of complexity to enable transformational change. And as my conversation with them progresses, you will learn more about them. So let me begin by welcoming our special guests. 25 years ago, our first honorand envisioned and invented the World Wide Web. what he now describes as humanity connected by technology. He replaced the unmarked pathways of the early information superhighway with an interwoven system of systems that provided the signage, the on-ramps, the addresses and directions necessary for a worldwide web that was easily navigable and open to the creation of ever more destinations. And he then invited all of us to join in to help make it what it has become today, a part of our lives that I dare say we could not live without. His work continues on a myriad of technology and policy fronts, including development of a web of data, what he has named the semantic web. Since its inception, he has held firm to his commitment to open access. He's advocated for universal standards and insisted on simplicity to ensure that the power of the web is available to all. His vision for a global space in which anyone with internet access could easily link and share information was revolutionary, and it has been transformational. The result of his genius has altered the human experience. For his work, he has been honored in many ways, but in particular, he has been honored by the Queen of England twice, knighted in 2004, and then in 2007, selected by Her Majesty as one of 24 members of the Elite Order of Merit. That means he is included among the most eminent scientists, engineers, and technologists from the UK and the Commonwealth, in the company of the greats, such as Sir Isaac Newton, and as a fellow of the Royal Society. Now, Time magazine included him among the 100 most important people, it said then, of the 20th century. He is one of the greats, and we are very pleased that he is honoring us by allowing us to honor him this weekend at Rensselaer. Please join me in welcoming Sir Tim Berners-Lee. As our next honoree notes, failure is a daily part of being a scientist, and the real breakthroughs only come once in a blue moon. In her case, demonstrating extraordinary brilliance, persistence, patience, and tenacity, she has had several one-in-a-blue-moon moments. Still in her 20s, working with her UC Berkeley mentor, Dr. Alan C. Wilson, she famously demonstrated that the genomes of humans and chimpanzees are 99% genetically identical. She conducted research now over a period of 17 years that resulted in documenting that breast cancer is inherited in some families as the result of mutations in the gene that she named BRCA1. Proving the naysayers wrong, her discovery transformed the field of medicine by identifying the genetic basis of common diseases. With a deep commitment to applying her skills for social good, she also pioneered the application of DNA sequencing in forensics, uncovering human rights violations on 6 continents. In doing so, she provided closure for families of victims of unspeakable crimes, and she helped to reunite the families of those who disappeared amidst the political upheaval in Argentina in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Passionate about genetics, enthusiastic about teaching, and committed to the application of science for the common good, she is a role model for a new generation of scientists. She has received countless awards and accolades, including the International Gruber Prize for groundbreaking work in genetics. She was elected to the National Academy of Sciences of the U.S., the Institute of Medicine, and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She has served on a variety of government, academic, and philanthropic panels, including advising the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal. Throughout her career, she has posed important questions, carefully generated, explored, and analyzed the data to answer those questions, and in doing so, unlocked some of nature's greatest secrets. And we are all the better for it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Claire King. Thank you, Shirley. Look at the list of top global leaders during the past few years, whether it is Forbes' lists of the world's most powerful people, Fortune's most powerful women, or Time Magazine's 100 world's most influential people. And you will find our next honorary. As Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of the IBM Corporation, where she has worked for more than 30 years, she started as a child, she embodies the kind of leadership required in a world being reshaped by constantly evolving technologies. As steward of the 103-year-old company, she has a keen eye for what needs to change and for what must endure. Throughout her career at IBM, she has seen through and managed complexity by merging disparate cultures to create unique capabilities and direction within one of the world's foremost technology enterprises. She has understood the power of research to generate the discoveries and innovations that transform lives. She has brought focus to the power of data as a new natural resource. By committing IBM so forcefully to the cognitive computing technology Watson, she is ushering in a new era of computing, shaping a world that will benefit from machines that think and learn, and in doing so, forever changing the fields of medicine, finance, ecology, and so much more. The fruits of her labors, I must say, have brought new vitality to the long-standing partnership between Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and the IBM Corporation. She is remarkable among business leaders. She is remarkable among leaders. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Rometty. So, you know, data is being generated by each of us, about each of us, and around each of us, and it's growing exponentially. There are satellites above us collecting data on air movements, sensors below us collecting data on ground movements, and cameras all around us collecting data on our movements. Think about what is going on right now in this room. No doubt there are sensors measuring room temperature. Medical devices are measuring heartbeats, and your communication devices, which I hope you've turned down, are sending and receiving tweets, emails, text messages, GPS signals. And this is all part of a rapidly growing network of networks, the so-called Internet of Things, on which our daily lives depend, including power, water, retail, financial, manufacturing, and social networks, all driven by the interplay of data, physical and cognitive systems, high-performance computing, and analytical models. Now, with all of this data, a natural question is, will we come to the right conclusions with regard to key challenges? The answer is, it depends. Data can be transformational if one asks the critical questions, makes the essential connections, and creates the necessary tools to make better decisions and to manage complexity. In each of their arenas, our 2014 honorary degree recipients have done just that. We have much to learn from how each has harnessed the power and potential of data to elevate the human condition. So let us begin the discussion with a focus on creating clarity within complexity to enable transformational change. Sir Tim, I would like to start with you. Now, although your degree is in physics, a subject near and dear to my heart, your work primarily has been in computer science. And you have said that your idea for the World Wide Web grew out of researchers' frustrations with the inability to access and share information among the networked computer information systems comprising the internet. Now, while working at CERN, the great high-energy physics lab in Switzerland, where I must say I had one of my first jobs as a physicist, you wrote a proposal to create a mechanism to connect unlinked data and called it the World Wide Web. Now, without question, you were seeking clarity amidst complexity. And I'm told that your boss famously wrote a note on your proposal, labeling your idea vague, but exciting. So as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the inception of the web, obviously the idea has turned out to be exciting indeed. So from that very first proposal of yours, you've remained steadfast and diligent, as I said earlier, in your commitment to simplicity as integral to keep the web open to all. So tell us really how you came upon this idea and about the root of your passion for simplicity and open access.
Well, okay, so here's the secret I haven't told anybody ever before. But seriously, yes, I suppose, okay, so physicist to physicist, all right, neither of which, and I wasn't really a physicist then, but I'd done 3 years of physics, and then when you do an undergraduate degree in physics, you don't learn enough to be able to work at CERN as a physicist. You learn enough to be able to go out and do some cool things with computers and microprocessors and things. But one of the things you pick up is the idea of generalization, that a physicist, you know, if somebody proposes a rule about how the world works, then what a physicist will do is look at the equations and think, wait a minute, can we shake those down so they're symmetrical? So we only have to remember one of those things. Right. Because you know what? Throughout the history of science, the really sweet little symmetrical, simple equations have ended up being much more common as actually working for describing the universe. So physicists will look at lots and lots of different systems and generalize. You know, look at lots and lots of things responding to gravity and then figure out, you know, that this inverse square law actually, for example, would work for the planets as well as for the apples, and so on. And that has been a good lead. So I was, as a software engineer, not a physicist, trying to do collaborative projects. A lot of the projects I did, CERN was at that point a very decentralized sort of place. People came from all over the planet. They brought their own computers. They did not work in a hierarchical organization where they all had to use the same type of computer or the same type of operating system. So they had sort of information about how the place worked and the information you needed if you wanted to build part of it. And there I was helping people build part of it and building parts of these things. You had to be able to figure out the other bits, and that would be stored on other computers, all kinds of different computers, and using all kinds of different sorts of documentation systems written by all kinds of people. And I'd seen people try to solve the problem by making the big documentation system to end them all, and then try to get everybody to use that one big system, which would mean using one, you all had to stop what you're doing and use the mainframe, or stop what you're doing and use IBM PCs or whatever it was.
I remember that.
So what you clearly had to, so looking at that, what I saw was the generalization. All these systems look different, but in fact, at any one point, you're looking at one, and you're reading some stuff on the screen and sometimes clicking on some bits. And so, in fact, you could imagine a thin layer which would map all these existing systems into one virtual system, where they would all connect together, and wouldn't that be cool? And once I had that idea, it's difficult to let it go, because it was going to be so much better world. So really, it was a question of looking for an excuse. And Mike Sendall, who made that comment, very exciting, in fact, unfortunately, he discovered that he had a nasty form of cancer exactly at the same time, which is partly why he wrote that on it, but didn't get round to then putting huge energy behind the project. But in general, it was the sort of project which had to be done in his spare time, but he let me do it in my spare time. We bought a cool machine. The next was a machine made by Steve Jobs when he was kicked out of Apple, or kicked himself out of Apple, and it had a wonderful spirit to it, really good development environment, and because of that development environment, when you open it, you get a pre-recorded multimedia message from Steve saying, "Welcome to the next. This is not about personal computing, it's about interpersonal computing, interpersonal computing." And he said that. And I thought, yeah, I'll go along with that. So it was perfect for designing the web. So that was, basically, so if you have to have in one line, it was a generalization which came out of frustration.
But then you took that frustration and you started doing some things to create this virtual machine. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, coding. So the basic rules was that everything should be available on the internet. I was at a critical point then when these computers may have had all kinds of weird operating systems, but bit by bit they were all getting connected one way or another to the internet. Some of them were connected to sort of proprietary IBM networks, some proprietary DEC networks, but all those people were starting to use those networks. Actually, they were tunneling IP through it anyway. Mm-hmm. So IP was just getting everywhere. People, even if the operating system didn't come with the Internet Protocol stack on it, people would code it up, and you could get what we now call open source. So IP was getting there. So basically, the deal was that you should run a little program on your computer, a web server, to make whatever data is available. Available. And the rule was that everything that was going to be on the web would have one of these funny address things that often start HTTP:. And so that was a big ask, really, and that was the only real ask, that everything should have a URL. And the URLs, now, a lot of the URLs, I designed this protocol HTTP, so I had to write the specification for that. It was a very simple protocol at the time. It's got more complicated since. But at the time, it was a very, very simple protocol. It would just open a connection to the server and say, get X, where X was the rest of the URL. So all the browser has to do when it's looking at one of these URLs is take HTTP:// take the computer name, look it up in the domain name system, then open a connection to the computer and then take the rest of the URL, send it off to the computer, the other computer, and get back the page encoded in one of a number of different ways. But typically, I designed this HTML hypertext markup language as a simple way of doing that, of basically being able to put across a screen of data, or a bit more than a screen of data, which people were with links. And the crucial thing about HTML, unlike other markup languages, has this very standard way of embedding another URL behind a bit of the text called an anchor. So the basic HTML was very simple, HTTP was very simple, but the real rule is everything's got to have a URL. In other words, it was fine to use other protocols, and in fact, there were other protocols around and still are. It's fine to use other formats, and I didn't expect HTML to take off. I expected it to be the sort of the warp and the weft of the web, but most of the stuff to be in other formats when you got to them. But in fact, it turned out HTML became powerful enough for actually being the main language for most of the content. as it turns out. So there you are, sort of 3 simple specs and a really important general principle. Everything should be identified by URL, or URI, as they were called in those days.
So Dr. King, now, you've heard what Tim did to try to begin to organize things a bit, but with a very straightforward idea. But you also had to manage a bit of complexity and try to create some clarity. And your work in clarifying the cause of some breast cancers began in 1974, I believe, which means that you did what you did long before many of the tools and technologies we now take for granted were even available and existed. But and interestingly enough, your actual breakthrough came in about 1990, just as Sir Tim was introducing us all to the World Wide Web. Now, throughout those 17 years, you've been quoted as saying that you were often working in obscurity. And although you did have some advocates, primarily physicians and loved ones who had dealt firsthand with the scourges of cancer in a single family, many in the science community did not believe you were on the right track. But you've created such a fundamental change in the way we think about disease that it's sometimes easy to forget that at the time, what you were proposing just did not seem plausible. So Tim was vague but exciting, and people were saying what you were doing was perhaps not plausible. So what made you confident you were focused on the right question? How were you able to make sense of all of that data? And, well, just talk about that.
Talk about that? Right. As Tim was talking, some of the themes that he mentioned really resonated with me, 2 in particular. One was to try to pull a very simple principle out of a great deal of complexity, and the other was that everything needs an address. So I'll talk about both of those in the context of what I was up to. It's probably not fair to say that I was confident that I was correct, but I was prepared to live with uncertainty for a long time while testing a logical idea. What I was confident of was that the hypothesis that I had in mind was a reasonable one. It might be correct and it might not, but that it could be tested and it could be tested rigorously. So the idea came to be born not because of me at all, but because of physicians and surgeons whom I met through the postdoc that I was doing at UC San Francisco. And these gentlemen, and they were all gentlemen in that era, were encountering in their practices basically two sorts of breast cancer patients with respect to one axis. Women who had breast cancer, as it were, out of the blue, and then a subset of patients who had breast cancer and had always thought they were going to get it. And they had thought that it was inevitable for them because their mother had had breast cancer, or their father's sister had had breast cancer, or their older sister had had breast cancer. The family seemed to be cursed in their own eyes with respect to this condition. And the surgeons and oncologists that I met said, these women are not doing anything wrong. These people are not smoking. These people are not exposed to asbestos. There's nothing in their lifestyle that pins this curse on them. It's got to be something else. So as a geneticist, as someone who had grown up doing evolutionary biology, as someone who thought about people in terms of our historic and evolutionary past, I thought, well, if I can apply the principles of evolutionary thinking to our relationships with our closest species relatives, I can certainly apply the same principles, presumably much more easily, to the relationships between subsets of our own genetic makeup. This was way before the word genome was in play, and how those are shared amongst individuals in the same family. So it was a matter first of collecting data in a really careful way, of collecting pedigrees from women, family trees, from women who were diagnosed with breast cancer and ultimately with breast cancer or ovarian cancer, and of constructing those family trees and of learning what had happened to each of the female relatives, going back as far as one could, which of course varied enormously depending on the family, and then coming forward in time. So for some families, that was simply the nuclear family. They didn't have history because there wasn't health care in their community before the immediate family. For other families, they could go back many generations and then come forward to third or even fourth cousins. So I had different sized families, but what these families shared, and these families were essentially all referred by my physician friends and then by the families themselves. They would tell each other about what was up. What the families shared was a willingness to become involved in the project, to tell me about breast cancer in the family to the extent they knew about it, and then to give a little blood sample so that I could pick up part 2, which is everything needs an address. The nature of part 2 of this project was after we had taken all of this pedigree information and we had applied to it essentially a very straightforward statistical analysis, nothing I invented, just something that I pulled from various bits in the literature, a maximum likelihood estimation analysis that allowed us to estimate the parameters that would obtain if the hypothesis of a major gene or genes with a very severe impact on risk of breast cancer obtained. And if that hypothesis were true, what would be the parameters with respect to age at onset, what would be the age-specific risks for persons who carried a mutant allele of this hypothetical gene, and what would be the age-specific risks for persons who didn't, conditional obviously also on gender, not 0 for men, but close to it. So once we had parameters, once we had parameterized the hypothesis, then the obligation became to show that this hypothetical gene either existed or didn't. And everything has an address. So if such a gene exists, it means it lives on a particular chromosome at a particular site. It has an address. Now, nowadays, if a student wanted to solve this problem, they would go to the World Wide Web and they would look up the address. And they would have done it in the time it has taken me to tell you this. It wasn't like that in 1974. There was no genetic map, there was certainly no genetic sequence, and there was no World Wide Web. So what those of us who were interested in one complex trait or another needed to do was to create that genetic map and create that genomic sequence at the same time that we were testing it in the families of interest to us. And that's simply what I did. No one does this alone. I mean, I did it with my little team, and I did it with the enormous emotional support of the families that were working with us, and I did it with the very substantial intellectual support of my physician colleagues. And I also did it with the support of NIH, because back in those days, this will be a shock to many of you, but in those days, if you applied to the NIH for an R01, and in those days an R01 was typically $35,000 a year, and you wrote a good proposal, you got your grant. Such a concept, right? So working with small grants, small teams, devoted participants, and devoted colleagues, it was enormous fun.
Well, one thing that's interesting in what you said is that in some ways, in doing these, the genetic mapping, you were creating a kind of architecture of the data.
That's exactly right.
And that reminds me of something that
exactly
I want to talk with Tim about, Sir Tim.
Tim, we're in America.
We're in America.
Tim. We had a revolution about that, Shirley. We've been there and done that. You approve, either too.
I know Tim is Tim, but I prefer to call him Sir Tim because I think it's really cute.
Poor Tim.
I know, but Jenny.
Sir
Jenny, right? Now, on your first day as CEO of IBM, you went to IBM's research facility in Yorktown Heights, New York. Believe it or not, I was offered a job there to speak with the researchers there. And your choice of venue, no doubt, sent a powerful message to your global workforce. So what did you have in mind? I mean, what was your intended message in starting your first day at the helm with a visit to the geeks, to the IBM Research Center?
Well, first I should say I need to teach those same people about $35,000 versus $6.5 billion. So I have to, which I spent $6.5 billion. To Shirley's point, I remember that day so well. And as everyone tells you when you prepare to take a new role, often many of the things that are unsaid in what you do are more symbolic than what you say. And so to me, that was very carefully thought through about where I should spend my very first day in leading such an iconic institution to this country, to this world. And so part of why IBM is what it is, it's why it's 103 years old, has been this legacy of research. It is really one of the few organizations that still has a commercial research organization. And in fact, I think you should be very proud. John Kelly, who runs our research organization, is an alumni, obviously.
And a trustee.
And a trustee of for your school here. So it's, he's here somewhere, I think, and has done where are you, John? Are you somewhere? I don't want to embarrass him, but yeah. So he has done a great job for you, great job for us. But what I wanted to do on that very first day was so important because this is an industry. Well, first back to IBM investing in research has never stopped, unwavering. Research and development, both of those things. And today our research organization is around 3,400 people around the world, 12 research satellites that work as one, as Tim talked about, one interconnected team together. And in fact, we opened the most recent research site in Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. Maybe we'll talk about and why. The first really commercial research organization on the continent of Africa. And, but that group pulled together has done and invented many of the great things. As Sir Tim talked about his invention of the World Wide Web, this group has in many ways invented almost everything the world has known around data, whether that was relational databases, hard disk drives, a list that goes on. And that was important to me. That very first day, you could tell it's an industry, and you all know it well, many of you in technology. This is an industry that violently innovates and can violently commoditize. And the only way to stay ahead is to do just that. And you must continue to invent. Or as many companies have proven in our industry, the end is in sight. It's the beginning of the end when you stop this. And so with unwavering support, I had, and one, wanted to send a message to research, the role that they played in making IBM 103 years old, and they would to the next, but that we were at a really what I felt was watershed moment in time. And to put it simply, as I look back over 100 years, really the whole world of computing as we'd known it, there had been two eras, if I put it very simply. The first era was machines that counted, just tabulated. They counted, you could maybe call that an abacus, but move forward, and anything you could think of, it's what did the census in the world, machines that counted. That you could easily call a tabulating era. The second era is all that we know to this day. Everything has to be programmed. In some way, it's programmed. Whether it's your smartphone, your tablet, whether it is anything you can point to, in the end, if this, do that, we have to tell it what to do. Programmable. But why I was there that day was the team had worked very hard on really at the very precipice of being able to launch something called an era of cognitive computing, which again, our two paths intersect between IBM and RPI. Cognitive meaning computers that you didn't program, they learned. And with all the data that we've just talked about in this world, the open world that's out there, and whether it's image, whether it's genomic data, we'll talk all about this hopefully today, there is no way you could ever deal with this amount of information. No one will be able to. In fact, we'll hit a period of frustration, be it because of privacy, security, or just pure frustration in much of data, unless you have the ability to have, I use the word systems very loosely, that actually can learn. And that is, in fact, what the IBM company had done and what IBM Research had launched, which was the era of cognitive. And they had, in fact, it was 2011, right before I was named CEO, just as you well, many of you participated, had a system called Watson play Jeopardy on television. And that was, in fact, and it's emblematic of this new era. So I spent my first day to not only symbolically be clear that this industry and this company only survives on innovation, and that is a role to never forget is a role that research plays. It plays an important part in our country, it plays an important part in our company. And it was the eve of what is this era of cognitive.
Well, you know, as steward of a more than 100-year-old company, you've been quoted as saying it is important to understand what must change and what must endure. and to position, and you are clearly doing this, and changing IBM to lead in this era of cognitive computing, big data, cloud computing. How are you driving change internally? And what is it that must endure?
You know,
aside from the company itself.
Yes, well, it's an interesting way as all of you go forward, and many of the graduates, I often, when people say that about a company, how to define a company, I think over my 30 years, always in a commercial side, what I've learned is never define a company by a product alone, because you will for certain be wrong. And so when we think about IBM and we say, be willing to change everything, but perhaps it's core values. So you have to be willing to change everything. Those that don't know our history, I mean, we started doing meat slicing, okay, and cheese slicing. This is not that interesting today anymore. So, nor would it have any margin. So that's it. And if we hadn't moved long past those types of things. And so this idea to be willing to reshape. So I simply, and as Shirley knows, we've talked about this, there are a couple big trends that I think this is, again, cognitive as an era, but we're at a point in time with technology that what is different than the past is a convergence of three things that are going to accelerate change that's never happened before. This is an industry that always has a lot of hype, lots of new things, something happens, but the idea that you have, call it big data, simply put, call it the cloud, anything offered as a service, IT or business process as a service, and then the world of mobility all at one time, it's creating this convergence in this spinning speed of change. And so that, as I've said, I believe it'll rechange the order of my industry, and as I tell many of our clients, it's gonna rechange the order of their industry too, and who's going to win and who's going to lose in the next decade here. And so, as Shirley said, for us, I see a future where you'll be able to take all this big data, and much of it connected in an open way, as Sir Tim talked about. And when I say all this kind of data, Mary Claire talked about genomic data, images, sensors, you name it. All of that will come together, and it'll change industries and professions. And then I think the cloud, it won't be about technology. It'll be about new business models. And then all of this will end up in one-to-one engagement with you and I, or machine to machine. And it'll all be because of mobility, social networking, but security, which I hope we talk about, it will all hinge on privacy and security. And we'll probably take a few steps backward and forward on that as that sorts its way out.
You know, I'm a physicist, but I have to tell you that my introduction to IBM was the IBM Selectric.
Another one that's gone now is the...
So, you know, as we listen to Mary Claire's work, clearly, you know, healthcare is an area that is certainly complex and obviously benefits when people can bring clarity to it. And it is an era that each of you, an area where each of you actually are involved, but in what might initially seem to be very different ways, but in fact, I believe have significant intersections. And Mary Claire, let me start with you. What do you think are the most significant, well, first scientific discoveries, but also technological changes that are having the greatest impact in your area on genetics research? And I'm particularly interested in your views on the impact of high-performance computation in genetics research. So could you talk about that a little bit? Because it's interesting, the evolution the world has made and the evolution you have made in your thinking about this.
No, it's both a completely different field and philosophically the same field as when I began working in it in the 1960s. As geneticists, we continue to ask the same questions. Where did we come from? What makes us human? What are the basis of human conditions, both positive and deleterious? How can we learn at the molecular level what those are? How can we resolve them? And how can we do this in such a way that allows people to live their lives to the fullest? Those questions haven't changed. What's changed absolutely completely is our capacity to answer them. So I'll start this with a story. The moral of this story is it's really important to stay intellectually agile. So last winter, I was teaching an undergraduate course at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I teach. And I was explaining to the youngsters, who are young enough to be my grandchildren, basically how to use the World Wide Web and quickly access a vast amount of genomic data that's in the public domain, link it to proteomic data that's also in the public domain, and identify then with genome sequence, which I had provided to them for each of multiple breast cancer patients, what were the possible mutations that might be causal for the breast cancers of these patients, both their inherited predisposition and in the cancers themselves. So all of this. So here I am up there with my little laptop in real time doing this. And I was doing it, as best I could, and linking things together. It's not that slow. I mean, he did invent something really good. So I was tooling along at what I thought was quite a nice clip. And one of the youngsters in the audience said, if you, and then he lets out with this long string of commands that I should use, it would be a lot quicker. And I stopped, and I looked at him, and I said, would you say that to your grandmother? and he stopped, and he said, no, you're right. You're fine. Just keep going. So for all of you grandparents out there, we just keep going. It will be fine. To me, the difference between now and 40 years ago, when I was a young beginning assistant professor in this business, is that you really do have the capacity in real time, in the dissertation length of a graduate student, to answer a profound question in biomedical research. And that capacity is absolutely beyond imagining. Darwin didn't imagine it, Mendel didn't imagine it, certainly none of us imagined it. And it's just irresistible to be drawn into this extraordinary period of scientific discovery. And it's because, in my field, it's because of the integration of physical technologies, that is our ability to determine the entire genome of a patient, the entire genome of a cancer cell, the entire proteome, that is the entire protein profile of that cancer cell at various stages of its progression, how it responds to treatment. And we can do all that in real time for reasonable amounts of money. And then the capacity to use all of that information in a logical way. So the challenge is just what all of us have been talking about, stating a simple hypothesis and testing it in a rigorous way.
Mary Claire, your work was really at the leading edge of what people now refer to as personalized medicine based on genetics. And you did a lot of amazing things without the tools and technologies we had today. So that kind of naturally leads me back to Jenny, because now we have Watson, right? And you had spoken about cognitive computing, and then I'm going to loop Sir Tim in here in a minute. Tell me what you see as the role of cognitive computing and Watson in particular for transforming medical care.
Yeah, with the same passion that Mary Claire talks about what she did and could begin to do faster and do in real time, I really believe in not just our lifetimes, in the next several years, we are going to change the face of healthcare. We will change it, and we will change it for many people in this world, not just the United States. It will be for many other continents where people never have the opportunity to be treated with the gold standard of any kind of medical practice. And I view that's our job. Our job is to scale the invention and to scale what that is. And so when Shirley talks about Watson, for those that maybe did or did not happen to see it, think of a system. It's an era, but think of a system that what it does, it understands natural language, so you could speak as I'm speaking. It could take a 30, 40, 50-page report Mary Claire wrote that wouldn't matter. And then, so take a system that understands natural language, understands the language of a doctor. If you've ever tried to read her notes, forget it, I think, right? I mean, it's a different language in its own.
I'm a Ph.D. in genetics. I write clearly.
Oh, you write clearly? Okay, the handwriting
I'm not a physician.
So you have to understand it. Then the next thing is you would guess what it has to do. I said it learns. And just think if you fed it all the data in the world. In fact, one of the first cancers we worked on is breast cancer.
That's right.
The hard cancers, hard tumor cancers. And so let's say you could take all the medical information in the world and load it into a system, feed it, as I say, ingest it, and then just say you had a system that could say, just like you described how you worked, forms hypotheses, but of course now it's doing hundreds, millions of these in parallel, all these hypotheses, tests it against infinite amount of data, comes up with a conclusion, and the percentage it believes it's right or wrong, and what other data, if it had, it could improve its percent confidence. That's what we then have been commercializing. And so it's with work with Memorial Sloan Kettering, the Cancer Center for diagnosis and treatment, Cleveland Clinic using Watson to train doctors, MD Anderson for clinical trial matching, and then just most recently the New York Genome Center for glioblastoma, one of the most horrible of brain cancer, to do the matching with the genomics to get the exact right treatments. And so that's the world that is almost at our fingertips. I mean, this is beyond pilot, these are rolling. And this is, to me, where all our worlds intersect. This idea where I think part of my institution's great role is to scale these applied science ideas, invent what has to be, scale the others. With what Sir Tim did, this ability to get to all this information, no matter where it happens to be, pull it in, and then Mary Claire with such of the invention that has been done around all of this genomic work. I really believe this will take, because healthcare is not really a system today. That's part of its problem. It is not a system, right? So it can help create a system out of something that's out there. So that's where it's funny. I think the three of us intersect in converge in quite an interesting way. Yes.
Well, see, so here's the thing. You talked about Watson, and Watson could even sort of pose or think about a question it might be able to answer if it had
more data.
More data.
So, a lot of the data is not always in the machine. It's on the web.
And it has to get it there too.
And so, here's where Sir Tim has done something else. You developed the semantic web. And I must tell you that Rensselaer has benefited from the groundbreaking work that you've done in this arena. Because researchers in our tetherless world constellation, that's what we call it, are focused on the semantic web, and some of our faculty continue to work with you on its development. Just as I kind of pushed you before, could you define a little bit for people the semantic web and talk about its potential in the context of healthcare?
Okay. Well, I can go back historically, even back to 10 years before the web. I wrote this program. I was actually at a separate visit to CERN, even cruder computers, had these 24 by 80 terminals. But in order to keep track of everything, I wrote this program which would allow you to sort of write down a sort of note card-shaped piece of information about something and link it to something else. But the interesting thing is that when you did that, suppose you wrote a note about a piece of hardware, something, and then you'd link it to and you'd write about a part of that hardware. As you connect it, the only way you could create a new note was by attaching it to the previous one, and you had to say how the two things were related, not how the notes were related, how the things they talked about. So this is a piece of hardware, this is part of it, this is a rack of equipment, this is a module on the rack, this is a description of it, this is the author of the description. So the whole point of it was capturing, the computer at that point understood the meaning of these relationships. The web had been going for a little while. Very rapidly, some of us realized, whoa, it's nice though it is to be able to surf all the cool stuff there is out there. We're missing the computer understanding what we're meaning. We have the relation. We have a document about, which is a title for a house. It says, that on a certain date, a given person transferred the ownership to another person. And there it is. It's a scanned PDF, and it's useless to computer. And if it's useless to computer, that means it's like use to us is pretty limited, because the only way we can use this huge amount of stuff is really by writing programs to do it. So yeah, surfing the web, people got sort of intoxicated with, because finding new stuff every moment, but actually being able to do useful stuff requires the computer to be able to use it. So the idea was we basically very simply decided, okay, we're going to have one language which is for human readable documents, but we'll have another language which is just the language of logic. It's the language of the machine, the things like Watson would use inside for remembering stuff, for keeping track of knowledge, for keeping track of relationships between it. So the semantic web is that. There have been people who've turned their nose up at the idea, but now, in fact, when you look at, for example, the big search engines, you realize that these search engines, when they started off just giving you a list of documents, but now if you put in a town or a person, they'll give you this data box. And it's clear that the search engine has not just found a whole bunch of documents which seem to be kind of about the thing that you're talking about. No, they know what the thing you're talking about is. They know it's a city, and they'll give you its population, and then they'll tell you the state that it is inside, and then all the relationships between and maybe some of the people who were born there. So, in fact, what's happened is a lot of the computing world has moved to this idea of the computers, not just storing data, but storing the relationships between things and storing the data in the way that they can understand it in some way.
The interesting thing about this, sure, please, go on.
Well, this impacts our lives every day because when we're trying to determine the critical genetic lesion that is the root of, say, some pediatric disorder, that will almost always be in a gene that we know nothing about. So the first thing we do is try to use the internet to understand the relationship between the lesion that we've just discovered, the gene that it's in, and then that gene with every possible connection to a condition. So are you saying then that this will be even more dimensional than it is now? Because it's pretty good now. How would this change? How would my ability as a geneticist to understand what a particular collagen does be different after the semantic web is online compared to now?
The systems you use are semantic systems. The computer, okay,
yes.
You're working, so you're using semantic web technology, apart from the fact that the programs you use are probably specific to genes. So that, for example, one of the things people have done is take the UniProt database of all these, these protein databases,
right,
and put them on the web and give things URLs. So a lot of this stuff has been ported to the semantic web.
I see.
So if the semantic web is a very generic term, so when you put documents on the web, you end up with all kinds of websites. When you put data on the web, you end up with all kinds of different forms of data. In your particular case, you have massive databases about genes,
exactly,
which you could export as a generic way. And I could look at using semantic web tools, and I could explore, and I could see the relationship between this gene and this protein. And I could see, and I could, for example, the semantic web, people were very fired up about it for biopathways.
Exactly.
Saying that this gene produces this protein, which blocks the effect of this one, which therefore could be used in targeting this symptom of this disease.
Well,
right.
but here's the thing.
Mary Claire, I'll introduce you to John Kelly. He does that already. Okay.
All right. I need that man.
Okay.
In fact, it's in production.
But there's a big snag in both the web and the semantic web. Okay, that it's all very well putting the facilities out there,
yeah,
but for that actually to work, all the people who are using this a given protein, name a protein.
Collagen.
Collagen. So people have to, okay, you said collagen, we'll say, okay, useful term, we're going to make http://coolsemanticwebs.org/standard/protein #collagen. Okay, and whenever you export your data, whenever you export, whenever you mention collagen at all in any respect, you must always use that URL. And then everybody will be able to link all the stuff they know about collagen together, and all kinds of incredible inferences will be made both by you and also by Watson browsing through all this stuff. But the problem is that when you do that, I say that to you, and you go back to your lab and they say, actually, we use this URL for collagen.
Oh.
No, we have a way around it.
Or they say, what do you mean by collagen exactly? Are we talking about all the...
Collagen 1 or collagen 12?
Yeah. Okay, so then... there's no free lunch when it comes to getting people
So let's broaden the discussion here.
Although I can't, here's me fighting
ready
with them, but I'm going to...
She solved it.
I do think we do have that solved, because that is the important part of a system that learns. I'm always, to make it I'm going to dumb this down, not collagens or proteins, but I'll always remember one of the questions Watson had to answer was about chicks. And actually, the way the question was written, it was referring to young girls.
Yeah.
And he was able to discern, because of the way it was written in context, that was girls, not chickens. And so this is the idea that the ability to learn context and what's around it, it really does exist in this learning mode. So we'll broaden it, but I do think we can already, we can go further
That's a hard
than this
one. That's
already.
Really a hard
and this
one.
is actually an important point. One of the things we've looked at is how do you do discovery when you can't make these exact connections? And in fact, if we rely on that having to happen, as Sir Tim was describing, that will never work either. You've got to have another way that the machine can put together so many different pieces of data and infer, I know these aren't called the same thing, they aren't, but they are the same thing. And then it builds that understanding and it gets refined over time. And that's
a hypothesis.
It's the and it tests against so much data, proves itself right or wrong, and then begins to also know which parts of data it can trust and what it can't trust. Because that's the other thing, there's so much out there, it's not all true.
The other piece, though, is that in the end, even as one wants to have fundamental understanding from, in terms of genetic linkages between this and that, one has to link it as well to treatment modalities.
Absolutely.
And that adds other layers of complexity, and I think that's what your folks are driving. Jenny.
Oh, and even when it comes to treatment, you enter more than just the medical reasons. There's personal preference, I mean, there's many other things that go into decisions around treatment, as an example, as you well know. So it broadens.
So let's shift the discussion a little bit to a focus on privacy. Because, as you know, on May 1st, the White House, in fact, issued a report on big data, which focused in part on privacy concerns. And as you know, further may know, I'm on PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And basically, essentially at the same time, PCAST also issued a report on privacy concerns. And it essentially then, one thing that becomes clear is that it is hard to know where privacy discussions really begin and end. Is it in the collection of data, the transmission of data, or the use of data? And so if I quote from the cover letter of the White House report, and here is the quote, big data technologies will be transformative in every sphere of life. That's what we've been saying here. The knowledge discovery they make possible raises considerable questions about our framework for privacy protections and about how they apply in a big data ecosystem. Now, in the text of the report, the authors note, and I quote, once data is collected, it can be very difficult to keep anonymous. And while there are promising research efforts underway to obscure personally identifiable information within large data sets, far more advanced efforts are presently in use to re-identify seemingly anonymous data. Collective investment in the capability to fuse data is many times greater than the investment in technologies that will enhance privacy. So the challenge, and therefore the overarching question is, how do we manage the trade-offs between access and privacy in this new data-driven era? And how does one reconcile openness and privacy protection? So Jenny, can you talk about how a major corporation like IBM approaches
this is a topic I and we spend a lot of time on for many both commercial reasons as well as with our clients and protection of their information. And sometimes I do, though, think of a simple framework because we have intuitively always traded off between security and our freedom, and we have traded off between privacy and convenience in many ways. We make these trade-offs intuitively with what we do. And so when you talk about just the use of personal information, I believe there's been much regulation or discussion of regulation. I'm on my way to Europe. This is a constant discussion. You and I have talked about this on data protection and the like. And there are so many motives at play because, yes, it's sometimes just for privacy protection of an individual. The other motives are purely commercial protectionism or perhaps even protectionism of a country to keep commerce within its own country, et cetera. So you have to distinguish the motives. And in this era, with that framework in mind, I think a couple sort of principles. I think we will end up, Shirley, in a world where between commercial companies and their customers, it will be about trust. And that trust will probably only be earned when there are things like opt-in and clarity about how that information is given and what's received in exchange for it. So you know what you've given, what you get back. And many people are willing to make some of these trade-offs, knowing what happens. Your other point, though, is there's kind of a third order. People take that data, they sell it to someone else. And so there was just recently the European Union had put a directive about the right to be forgotten. At a certain point, you should have a right to be forgotten. But to your point, you know, the first order of data you might stop, but then what happens after that, it's almost it is impossible, actually. And so this idea that if instead, though, of regulation, we focus on things like trust, opt-in, clarity of how the information is used, and I, for one, always err on the side of open self-regulation than I do regulation in many of these cases. Obviously, there's critical infrastructures and the like. I think that's a different subject to be discussed. But if it's just privacy of personal information, how we deal with it with all of our clients, by the way, is both this idea that you need to take a perspective of opt-in and the way you have to guard it as a company. Right? And we, in fact, recently just announced a set of offerings called Crown Jewel Protection. I mean, in the future, when you talk about security of a company and all of the, if I could branch just a little bit to things like cybersecurity, I know a topic, again, one you're very expert on. But there is, you may say, I'm going to put a fence around this, a moat around a castle. Those days are over. It's like your body, the analogy to me, we were talking so much about our genetics and bodies, that you have to assume bad stuff is in. Bad stuff will get in. Your body has germs in it all the time, but you have an immune system that reacts and adapts and attacks those germs. And that's, in effect, what we're going to have to do when it comes to protection of information. And that, by the way, circles right back to a big data problem in the end. But so for commercial, I would very, very much on the side of the importance of protection, but that this be about an opt-in world.
I want to come back to that. But Mary Claire, you do basic research. So how do you think about and balance this question about the access to information required for complex research and then branching into development of effective medical therapies and intervention with the need for personal privacy? How do you think about that?
Right. We are, in my world right now, in the medical research world, I think, at a tipping point. We have, for the last 20 years, been obsessed with privacy, and I use the word advisedly, to the point of not allowing investigators to contact people to ask if they would be in research projects without jumping through innumerable regulatory hoops, hoops that really distance the investigator from families that would like to be involved in the research. So the regulations have, in fact, they have frankly slowed down the research. And in a technological era where the technology is not slowing you down, being slowed down by the regulatory impediments is really ridiculous. It's reached the point of hypocrisy. On the one hand, here we are with the capacity to do an enormous amount of work, and we're not allowed to even ask the people who would be able to most benefit from it if they would like to participate. Of course, those persons should have the opportunity to opt in. Yeah. But we should be allowed to ask them the question. So we are, I hope, at a tipping point where, because of the massive amount of technological power that is now out there and the massive amount of data that is collected about all of us, whether we know it or not, that this regulatory infrastructure that has come to exist and slow us all down is so out of date and so anachronistic that it will be recognized at a national level, and there will be a reform of it. Now, these are, fighting words, and I'm probably going to get in a little trouble when this goes out over his web, But we need reform of what have been called privacy provisions in my world, and have been, in fact, distancing provisions that have precluded the involvement of subjects in research.
Yeah.
Well, Sir Tim, as we've discussed, open access has been at the core of your belief regarding the viability of the web. So how do you think about that reconciliation with the individual's right to privacy?
First of all, let's take open access is a phrase normally used for open access to journals, for example, and to public data. So that's completely different.
That's completely different.
Okay, so open, yeah, that's a separate form of the word open. You can, and yes, I've pushed for certain things to be open, in particular academic information, certainly scientific data, because I think the world works much better that way. But I've never pushed for everything to be open. So if you put something on the web, for example, absolutely no reason why it shouldn't. You know, a huge amount of the information in our daily lives, like the various calendars we share with people, that's very private stuff. Oh, there are some public calendars. We may have a calendar of the local sports teams or rock concerts are on, but and there may be and so on. But when you look at a calendar, you're mixing data from various different places that very different organizations and families that you work with to look at your life. A lot more data should be like that. Mm-hmm. So, in fact. For the public, so the open access stuff is rather relevant for the point of view of privacy. When it comes to, I think, what I would like to be able to do with personally, as an individual with my data, I would like to be able to get the benefit of it. There's a lot of fuss at the moment from the fact that people see that companies are making money by selling. When I click on a link, when I buy something online, then the fact that I bought something online can be connected with me through my IP address and some very smart software, and that information is then sold to people who build profiles of me, and those profiles are then sold on so that people can target me with advertising. And you know what? That's some individuals say, wait a moment, I should get a piece of that cake. If you're selling data about me, I should be. It's my data. I should own it. Boring, me, not very much value. The value about the information you have as me as a dot, as a data dot out there, that's not very interesting. No, what is interesting? If you're looking for a market for that data, who's going to be really interested in that data? Is it going to be the advertising people? Is it going to be? It's going to be me. Hello, it's data about me. So I want to integrate my data. So certainly I want to do it for healthcare, but healthcare connects. So I've got an app on my portable device, which has now since it's been tracking my movement, helping me look at my sort of how fit I've been or not been since last October. Sort of day and night. It's got, if you wanted to sort of accuse me of crimes or something, it's got, it knows where I've been on the planet. Pretty much every few minutes, it knows how much exercise I've got of which type. And so that is really interesting to me. So I think it's, it'll be, I've got it all on my laptop. I've got it all, a large amount turned into semantic web data formats, so I can do queries on it. I can run all kinds of useful things administratively. Obviously, now I have if I'm filling in my expenses, the fact that I know where I was at every point, and I've got, I can connect that up to business trips. I can even deduce that I was on business trips, work out who should pay for it. I could realize that a piece of transport I took from here was a taxi. I can connect it up to the bank statement, which is also downloaded and on the same laptop. So I've got the fact that I physically was in transit in something like a taxi, and I've got a bank statement that I paid for a taxi. I should be able to make those up, figure out who to charge it to, and end up breaking even at the end of the day. So, and being able to automate the entire bureaucratic process of going through all these things. But also, I should be able to download a very smart piece of software, which somebody else has developed, which has learned from millions and millions of other people who are doing the same thing, which will look at me and say, Tim, you should probably go for a checkup early this year, because you shouldn't skip a year, because, you've been exercising and stuff, but, your weight's been creeping up a little bit, and you haven't been, you've been busy, but I know, but why don't you just go to the doctor and get your heart checked out, sort of early this year, because we have a sense that it would be a good idea. And when I say it would be a good idea, I can tell you that if you would have a 0.01% greater of dying, next week, because depending on whether you do and you don't, because I've compared your data to all this other stuff. So there's a huge potential in the use of personal data about ourselves, not for marketing, not for healthcare, for all kinds of things. For me, figuring out how to run my life. How's my career going? If something knows this much about me, what movies should I go and watch? What people should I be introduced to? There are lots of really interesting questions in my life where a very, very smart companion is going to be able to solve them very, very well, using the power that things like Watson have, plus access to all my data. So I much prefer it that when I go to a hospital, the reason that the hospital have access to my patient records isn't because they've managed to solve this massive vocabulary problem in the sky and get all the problems talking to each other, but because actually they're legally obliged to give me the data anyway, and I've got it. So for me, personal data integration is where it's at, and and for the geeks out there, it's a lot of fun writing all those little scripts to put it all together.
Well, so here's the thing. It sounds to me like where we're coming down has to do with the use of data.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Because this fusion of data or integration of data, and some of it can just be publicly available, seemingly innocuous data, from multiple sources, can create a picture of the individual that's more revelatory than that person may have intended. Mm-hmm. See, so
you're right.
So the kind of integration you're talking about is kind of more deliberate, but this revelation is very interesting, and so it really does raise a question of, can there really be any real expectation of privacy?
But as you say, it's the use of data. So you started off talking about privacy, talking about the collection,
that's right,
the transmission, and the use.
The use.
And clearly we need to shift it.
That's right.
Yes. Locking it down, as you said, is no longer an issue. That's not going to happen.
You can't do it.
Because it's going to seep through by osmosis. People will be able to infer it from other data. And you can never predict that because you never know what other data will exist out there. So all we can do is move to a world where we have expectations about how particular data is used. So when RPI, if I apply for a job at RPI, and I've got some rather, I'd really like it if, on the application form for the job, if RPI had a little checkbox.
Right. Well, you can have the job, the trustees are here, you get tenure tonight. Checkbox in there.
Clearly,
she's very optimistic.
Clearly,
this is always
I have to work on my subjunctive. Were a person, imagine that a person were to apply to a job in RPI, then that person, I would like it, were that to happen, that person should have a checkbox so that they can say, I do or do not want you to look at my social networking history, particularly before I was a minor, for example. Suppose you decide the next Board of Trustees meeting, whenever you're all here, I guess, you could decide that, in fact, right now. You could decide, okay, that we will decide, that RPI will decide that social networking stuff when you were a minor may be taken off the table, not because it's the regulation, not because it's a law, but because RPI just thinks that the world is a better place if we work like that. And the result is people of all shapes and sizes will come and apply for jobs at RPI. Some of them will be very proud of the things that they did in high school and put on Facebook. Some of them will be less proud, and they will choose. But you will say, this kind of data will only be used with your permission. And in general, medical data, obviously medical data, in an emergency, if somebody is dying in front of you and you're a doctor, you use whatever information you can find from anyway. Okay, when you're enrolling somebody enrolling somebody administratively in a hospital, then you can only use the data that they've given you.
That's right.
And so, and you may be the same person, but you have to switch mode. And lots of people in RPI, in a hospital, in government, certainly in the police, come across data in all kinds of, in different parts of their job, and they have to be able to put on these different color spectacles. So one of the things which I think is exciting is to build software which allows them to do that, to be accountable, so that when somebody makes a decision, so that's one of the things we're doing.
I agree with you, actually. I should not be revealing my point of view, but I think this question about use of data is where the worm will turn. And so, but I think at this point, it is vague, but exciting. Now,
Very good.
IBM as a corporation has been really promoting data analytics curricula, including here. And that really relates to this question about accessing data, but also making use of data, perhaps in ways that Sir Tim has been talking about. Why is this such a priority for IBM?
You know, something I said earlier, to me it's a priority for IBM because I think it's a priority for the world. I mean, and I do believe any graduate in this, no matter what your discipline is, your future, whatever role you perform, there will be a silver thread of this world of data through the middle of whatever it is that you do. And so, to me, this is, when you talk about reinventing a company for something, this era of data, it'll be new professions, it'll change how you do your job, it's gonna change how a doctor does his job, it's gonna change how a marketing person does their job, how your CFO does a job, a risk person does their job. And I always say to people, to know what you really believe, look where you put your money. And we've put $24 billion into building the portfolios to do this kind of work. And I think it's exciting, and I do think it is about the uses, and we are just at the beginning, right? Which is I've used the words of a natural resource. I think we'll look back, data will be the phenomena of this time, and always revisionist history, right? We'll look back, and it will be to the 21st century what things like steam, electricity, and others were to their centuries. It will unleash a whole set of things, some of which we know, others, as you said, vague but promising, that are out there that I think is so wonderful and that will solve so many problems that weren't solved before. So I think that in and of itself, when I look at all the different things I see clients do, you know, Tim was using that example, already you see banks putting out applications of, I'm on my mobile phone and you can say, let me see what people like me do with their spending. You know, how much do that, you know, people like me spend on entertainment, spend at Starbucks, spend at whatever. And these are just not barely scraping the surface of what it is going to be in front of us. And it'll attack things like, you know, the climate. It'll, in a good way, the climate, all these issues that are so systemic, water, which you guys are working on, a lot of these things. That will be the heart, because often we talk about, we've talked a lot today about people and data. The big data is going to be between machines. People, and it'll be, the big world won't be big data, it'll be fast data. In fact, estimates are there'll be so much you can't even store it in the world, right? Yeah. John's researchers will tell me in 10 years, there won't physically be enough magnetic storage of any kind to store all the data that'll be there, because everything will be talking about itself. Every sensor, everything, every place, every, you know, emitting something. And so it's going to be this world of fast data. So that's what I think it's going to move very quickly.
I think, you know, it raises a question about how you put intelligence into everything. And, but, you know, we're kind of privileged. We sit here and we talk about all the potential for, you know, big data, you know, the web. But it's easy to forget that 60% of the people on the planet actually have no access to the data we're talking about because they have no access to the internet. And so, Tim, you've worked to bring attention to this issue. So maybe I can start with you. What do you think the implications are for individuals who don't have that access? But more importantly, what do you think can be done to expand, you know, the access to those who are currently offline, as it were?
Well, I think, so 5 years ago, a bunch of people who were mostly involved in technology, making the web more and more powerful and cool, developing standards at the Web Consortium, realized that every time you make it more powerful, then the gap between the possibility of the opens to the people who've got it and the people who don't get, got bigger. Sometimes I think people tend to take it for granted, not realize if you look at sort of millions of examples. But for example, suppose you want to start a company and you you think of a really crazy name for it, you can, without getting up from your seats, as long as your phone is turned to silent mode, you can Google for this crazy name of the company and know within a few seconds that nobody else on the whole planet has thought of that name for a company. Okay, if you're sitting there without the web, and whether it's because you're illiterate or it's because you're typically because you're too poor to have access to the phone, or because you're in an area which hasn't been covered, then you can't. It's the whole, you can't query the whole planet immediately. Lots of things you can't do. Lots of ways in which you just can't start your business. Lots of businesses you can't start. So, obviously, there are lots and lots of other, there are huge differences in the way life goes. And we realized also that whereas we started off thinking that it would be hubris to imagine we should get some luxury like the internet to people before we got them water and healthcare, people turned it around and said, no, actually, the cheapest way of getting healthcare, a lot of healthcare is information. It's what to do, it's how to diagnose things. Actually, if you get them the internet, they can learn this information, and they can share this information with other people of the same, who live in similar circumstances. And actually, a lot of, like water, well, that's economics. It costs money to buy a pipe. One way of getting money to buy a pipe is to run a business. One way to run a business is to sit there, have an internet connection, and say, translate from things from English into your native language. So suddenly we realized that, oh, actually, this is more complicated. Actually, we should start working on putting connectivity in further up the agenda. How to do it? Well, the Web Foundation is now 5 years old. It's a very small foundation because it wasn't started with with the endowment of some wealthy family. It sits there and tries to coordinate people and manage and connect people, funders with good projects. One of the things it has is the Web Index. The Web Index looks at 80 or so countries, and just by taking in a whole lot of different aspects, going and looking at the country in some ways, but also using other indices, tries to analyze and give a number to whether they are making good use of the web. So it sort of sets the agenda. So any country can look at their index, look at where they come out in the index, and because the data is all open, they can download the spreadsheet and figure out, okay, according to the Web Index, if we are going to use the web better, we should be opening up government data, or we should, we should be connecting more people online in the rural areas or something like that. So it has, the Web Index is one useful sort of agenda setter tool. There is an Alliance for an Affordable Internet, which has governments and companies and NGOs coming together, trying to talk about best practices for getting the price of a mobile device plus the price of data down to something which will be less than the huge, say 5% instead of 40% of somebody's annual income by, say, 2020. So getting the prices down tends to mean keeping the market competitive, and not letting one monopoly provider take over the country.
Let me go in a slightly different direction, relative to this question about data, use of data, access. Mary Claire, you've been called a sort of quintessential citizen scientist. And the work you did with the disappeared in Argentina was amazing. And can you talk about a little bit about your work on human rights cases and your view about the role of scientists getting out of the lab and into the fray, and then how these technologies of today can even strengthen the ability to do things in that arena?
Sure. I think it's independent of any one technology, but the opportunity that it affords is for a scientist in any particular field to be able to exploit their technologies for a question that comes along. In the situation you're referring to, the grandmothers of Argentina, who are called in Spanish the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, had founded themselves as a group when the military took over in Argentina in the mid-1970s to demand information about what had happened to their grandchildren. Their young adult children had been taken and presumed, and in virtually all cases, in fact, killed. But there was circumstantial evidence from word of mouth that the grandchildren, in many instances, had survived and had been taken from the homes where the parents had been disappeared and murdered, and the grandchildren had been kept inside the military subculture, sold, and so on. And so as the years went on, children were surfacing that didn't fit with the people who were presenting them as biological children. So the grandmothers, through friends of friends, asked me to solve this problem. And they asked me in particular, I think both because I had taught in the Southern Cone, I can teach in Spanish, but I think much more importantly, I was exactly the age of their daughters who were disappearing, and my daughter is exactly the age of their grandchildren. So I took it as any other hypothesis. I collected the data that was available, which they had done extremely well. These are no-slouch ladies. I have now realized, now that I am this age, you do not mess with grandmothers. And then I developed a hypothesis testing structure around what they needed to know, which was when a child is presented, and this became possible after the end of the militaries, essentially at the end of the Malvinas-Falklands War and the election of President Alfonsine, it became possible now to bring cases to the family courts to require evidence to decide who custody should be awarded to. And so what we needed was data of the sort one needs for any custody case, obviously in an abnormal context. And so we just kept pushing the envelope, because in this case, appreciate that from the purely genetic point of view, we are asking, who is this child in the absence of their parents, in the absence of their putative biological parents who have disappeared? And it's very easy to show who the child's not. It's very easy to show that the child is not the child of people who are claiming it's their child. But as the abuela said, we don't need to know who these children are not. We know that. We need to know who they are. So it was a matter of developing technology that would allow us to skip a generation in making that determination. We began this in the pre-DNA era, so it was working with blood groups, with protein polymorphisms that are used for matching for tissue transplants, and a system for doing that had been developed by Dr. Dosset in Paris, and he had, in the context of the time, a worldwide database of that information. And so we could take information that we would obtain using the same biological tests and fit it into his database and say the chance that a child would have this particular constellation of protein, what we would now call protein polymorphisms, it was called something different then, given the protein polymorphisms of their grandparents for these same proteins, is 1 in 10,000. So at first, we developed that kind of approach. And very quickly, we were asked to work with cases that were contextually more difficult, situations, very common situations in which not all 4 grandparents were still living. So we developed a trick using mitochondrial DNA, which is purely maternally inherited. Demography being what it is, if there's one grandparent alive, it will most frequently be the mother's mother, just age structures being what they are. And mitochondrial DNA was clearly put into evolution by God specifically for this purpose, so that we can now, using mitochondrial DNA sequencing, determine the specific maternal lineage of any child, male or female child. You inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mother, regardless of your own gender. And all the way back, as Alan Wilson would have said to Eve. And mitochondrial sequences are so variable that you can effectively identify any one maternal lineage that way. So we exploited that realization. The technology got very fast, and now this is it's used by the United Nations, it's used on all continents. I get called in only when there's a particularly thorny situation. But it represents what, to my mind, are the 3 critical principles of doing what I call righteous science. One is the most important questions are asked by the people on the front lines. The second is the most righteous science demands the most rigorous science. And the third is no question is too big to ask. And I learned that from these women over the intervening 30 years. And it's been very helpful in every other aspect of my work as well.
It's fascinating, and thank you.
Yeah.
You know, Jenny, many corporations talk about going into emerging economies. And many times that does not include the continent of Africa. And but you mentioned a different kind of commitment of IBM, which is to actually put a research facility in Nairobi. Why'd you do that?
I have a strong belief in the continent of Africa, and that I think for many decades people have said this is its time, but I think this is its time, and for a couple simple reasons. First off, it's not one place, so it is very different than anywhere else in the world. It's 54 countries, and they are very different. But if you just look at some of what's happening within the whole continent, it already has a middle class larger than India's, by 2020 a working population greater than China's, and then as well, there are almost 500 companies over $1 billion inside, very entrepreneurial companies in many ways, entrepreneurial. And perhaps more profound is that you begin to see now, and in the face, it's hard to say this in the face of what's happening in Nigeria with the young women that are gone, but you can see some political stability in the face, and you could see political transitions without violence in cases. Now, it will always be a place, whether it was Egypt or what, that a few steps forward, a few steps back, two forward, one back and forth. But you can see it, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the entrepreneurialism that is in the continent at large, and to Mary Claire's point, a very interesting, it is the women of Africa that are a very interesting lot, if I can be so generic in its saying. I remember doing a research project, maybe it was now for me 10, 12 years ago, and it was on what would make that women of Africa finally sort of arrive. And the role that women play in that society and the strength of the women in the entrepreneurialism across many different countries is so huge. So it's got some very unique characteristics. And so I believe strongly, we believe strongly as a company. So we've been there since the 30s. So it isn't like we haven't been in different parts of Africa, but we were in 4 countries and 8 countries. And over the last couple years, we've now expanded to 24 countries. All very different. And I also found I had 1,600 IBMers who were from Africa at some point in their life, who I talk about grandmothers. When Mary Claire, I can make many a phone call to say, wouldn't your children like to see their grandparents? And wouldn't you like to go back there for a little while? So, because one of the biggest inhibitors, though, is values ethics in bringing that into the workforce, right? So you also have to nurture a workforce that works in a way that that resembles the values of your firm. But I think it will be, so something that Sir Tim was saying, Africa will be one of the places that you will leapfrog, and necessity will be the mother of invention, and there will be, and I think, many areas where you will find these different solutions that will be in a completely different paradigm. So one of the great examples we recently had in Nairobi, the teams in Nairobi in Kenya, if you were to do traffic management, if any country or any major city, it would be a tax referendum, hundreds of $millions, cameras everywhere, watching your car, changing the street lights, monitoring your progress, getting your toll across the bridge, et cetera. Well, you can't do that in these places, and traffic is horrific. Back to big data and this leapfrog idea, the team said, you know what, there's 9 crummy cameras in Nairobi, 9 crummy cameras. They're just kind of, CCTV kind of grade of a camera, no big deal. But they said, you know what, maybe that's all we need. I bet we could predict where those cars are going. We don't know them, but we could probably predict and be close enough. And with that, we could then send out messages on text to everybody on what it is on traffic and what to do. I mean, this is a scale that's a completely different scale of what you would do, and the same will be true for medicine. So some of what our research lab there is going to work on is I kind of term it good enough government. I mean, government on a scale that's completely better scale, you know, much less in price and everything and more effective. And you've got as well, when we talk about reach, boy, I'm so excited with the technologies. You could take, and we're doing some things, and even in India today, bring it there, a 2G phone. That would be kind of a feature phone, the old-fashioned. Many of you probably don't even have one. Maybe some of you never knew them in your life even. And you know, a few dinosaurs still use them. And my brother still has one. It goes like this and that kind of stuff. And that kind of phone that they've found the technology to simulate data on it so that you can participate then in this world. And you don't have to be able to type. And you could be the spoken web, you can do all these other ways to interact. And so I think you could tell my excitement, so much promise. It will be the last big growth frontier for this world, I believe. And it will be this next decade. And it's the kind of thing, though, if you don't get there and become of the countries, right? Which is, I think, so important to be of a country, not a visitor to the country. You have to be of the country, participate. So one of the things we did recently, when we not only announced the research center, we put a $50 million investment to put Watson in Africa as an example. For some reason, and Mary Claire, maybe you can work on it, unbeknownst, it's one of the largest places of cervical cancer for women.
We do know why.
Okay.
Probably not today's topic.
On how to solve some of that. Okay. So we'll hook Mary Claire up with this, okay? Right. We're gonna hook her up because I got a lot of money going into this, and if it can go faster, that's better. Yeah, and sure. So we'll put this together. Sure. So made an investment with there, but the other and the last thing, we just recently said, you know what, we're going to take all of our curriculum on analytics, and actually, frankly, all of our curriculum, make it free to every university in Africa, because this is really going to be an issue of education. Yeah. And so make it free. As you all know, as a university, though, you got to get the professors to teach it too, right? Okay, so free is not always an enticement to
The students will push the teachers.
And then they will be, hopefully come out of school, because that's one of the challenges in many countries in Africa. They come out with skills that are not applicable. And so you could then help them with skills that would be applicable for industry. And there's such a need for it. So I believe it is the next growth frontier for the world.
Well, what's interesting is that we actually believe very strongly here that our students, all of them ideally, should go abroad. You talked about the students there developing skills applicable for industry, but there's actually the converse issue, which is innovation that's relevant to the given place. Absolutely. You talked about being of a country, but being of a country means that the innovations have to work for them.
That's right.
And that's whether it's in healthcare, being an entrepreneur, whatever it takes. And so there's a great opportunity. Well, before we run out of time, we want to explore questions a little bit from the public. We invited people to tweet, to text, and to email us questions in advance. We also have questions that have been tweeted and texted and so on to us by the audience here in the concert hall, as well as others who are watching online. And so in an effort to kind of get through the questions if necessary, you know, I will kind of summarize. But I wanted to start, though, very specifically, because we're an educational institution, with a question for each of you from our students. And so there are 3 students who said they had the nerve to
They're running out now, I think.
They're out of doors.
And so I think there's a young lady by the name of Meredith Giblin who said she has a question for Dr. King.
Oh, very fine. Where's Meredith?
She's right there.
She's right here. Great. Hi.
Hi. They are.
Okay, it does work. So I was wondering, when I learned that I was going to be asking this question, I did a little research on you and was quite impressed. But I saw that you came out in support of the recent Supreme Court decision making it illegal to patent a human gene. You can patent the technology, but not the actual sequence. And so I was wondering if you could expand on your opinion on this and what, you know, you did talk about how regulation can sometimes prevent scientific advancement. So, and also just how the importance of governing scientific advancement in a positive way and not some way that's going to hamper innovation.
Right. This patent case, because it addressed a patent on the gene I care most about, which is BRCA1, breast cancer 1, was of course one I followed very closely. And the consequence of the exclusive, of the monopolistic enforcement of that patent by the company that had it had very much slowed down the growth of technology in actual testing in the clinic for predisposition to breast and ovarian cancer in women. So it was a situation in which having only one, in the States, only one commercial source legally available for testing was an impediment to healthcare. The patent issue is clearly complex. I am an absolute fan of patents for real inventions of real things. I think that American technology has been enormously benefited over our entire history by the existence of patents that have rewarded creativity and innovation. The difference between developing something that is new, whether it's IP or whether it's something concrete, and exploiting what's in the public domain and being the luckiest kid on the block who happens to use already existing technology and be lucky with your experiment, whereas your next door neighbor was not, is vast. And it seems to me that the development of patent law in this country, back to the very beginnings of it, was intended to reward innovation and creativity and not the luckiest kid on the block phenomenon. And that the principle of patent should do no harm is also enormously important. There's also a very important principle which got lost in this whole patent shuffle in my world, although I think it was not lost to people who work with patents every day, and that is that there's a tremendous difference between patenting something and then licensing it to many different users, which of course is required with patents that are essential for the development of modern communications technology, versus having a patent and then refusing to license it to anybody except for completely exorbitant paybacks. So to my mind, the use of patents in a non-exclusive licensing setting is a totally different world than the use of patents in an exclusive licensing setting. And these all converged on a case, on the BRCA1 case, that is in fact so much at one extreme of this distribution that clearly the Supreme Court found it an easy call, for which I personally, of course, am enormously grateful.
Well, thank you. Mary Claire, I should tell you that Meredith is a biochemistry, biophysics major.
All right.
She's graduating this year.
And what's next for her?
Meredith, what's next for you?
I'm going to graduate school at Vanderbilt for my Ph.D.
Fabulous. Great. Congratulations.
And Meredith did undergraduate research on DNA damage and aging.
Excellent. You're going to the right place then. Very good place.
Professor Patrick Maxwell in our Department of Biological
Lovely.
Sciences.
Lovely. Vanderbilt's excellent in that.
So I think there's a young man named Simon Ellis who has a question for Sir Tim. And Simon is a Ph.D. student in fact, in the tetherless world constellation, Tim.
Hi, Simon.
So, Tim, good afternoon. I've been very privileged for the past year to work with Professor Jim Hendler on IBM Watson and cognitive computing, a very new field. It occurs to me, especially sitting and listening to the conversation, that my colleagues and I here and elsewhere who are working in this field, we're in a not entirely dissimilar position to the one in which you found yourself 20, 25 years ago, at the sort of the unfolding, the forefront of an unfolding technology, and one that could conceivably change the way that people interact with and use computers and data and information, like the World Wide Web did. I have a question. Do you have any advice for us? Us and anyone actually at the leading edge of a new field for how to make the most of this kind of moment?
Well, so that's quite a general question. I don't know whether it to be. So the field. So with the semantic web and with linked data, it's similar to the web in lots of ways. Use a URI for everything, and it's about linking. So in that, so things like that, things which happen on the network are different from other developments. Like you can, so for example, you can do about mousetraps, you can do research and you can do development and you can do and you can then put out a product to make a better mousetrap. For a network thing, you have to imagine a world in which a whole lot, billions of devices are doing, this thing is ubiquitous, and so you have to get everybody involved to use a standard. So that's different. So now I was lucky in that originally when I developed the web, I just could do it on the back of an envelope or a very small web page, and then it got complicated from then on. But originally I had nobody looking over my shoulder. I think some of the tricky things that you'll have with your systems are the balance, finding the balance between trying to get everybody else on board to use the same standard so that all these things will interoperate, because only when they interoperate will you get the benefit of huge scale, and deciding that just they're so obnoxious, it's so difficult to talk to them, and they won't do it our way anyway, realizing that it's a research project and you've got your Ph.D. to do, and so you design and demonstrate a system which isn't interoperable, but is very cool and advances the state of the world. So there are those trade-offs to do, and it's not, I think, choosing those things is careful, is something where you have to be, look at it carefully. I think seeing how something network gets picked up, monitoring it. In the old days, we looked at the NSF backbone traffic, which used different TCP port numbers, and you could see the different sort of networked information systems growing in popularity, and sort of check that you're on track for taking over the world or not. In this case, looking at certainly monitoring how people use things and getting a lot of very, very direct feedback from people is important. I think you have to avoid the trap of putting too much energy into converting legacy systems. When you make a beautiful new system, we found with RDF, for example, the people were making XML-based systems which sort of didn't get it, which were hierarchical rather than graph-oriented all the time. And it was very tempting to turn around and try to persuade each one that, you should do that using graphs. In fact, now they've made their XML-based systems. That was fine. It was a really, you don't have time. You don't have the energy to try to convert people who are using different sort of legacy paradigm to use the new one. Also, it'll be an uphill battle because they'll be so sold on their and so invested in their existing paradigm. They'll have all their tools to use it and so on. So I think I suggest that you build, just sit there building a world of people who are as advanced thinking as you can. Be very, very open to them wherever they are on the planet, and share stuff openly, but don't and work in that growing group of people rather than trying to convert other people.
Thank you, Simon. I think Kelly Piotrowski has a question for Mrs. Rometty. Now, before you ask your question, let me note that Kelly is this year's recipient of the Henry Kumpf Award, which meaning she has been honored for both her academic and athletic achievements, and she is graduating with a 3.9 GPA in mathematics and is a basketball player.
Very good. Basketball.
And basketball?
Yeah, basketball.
Wow.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a question about big data analytics in healthcare on a more micro level. How do you foresee these cognitive and analytic capabilities becoming relevant to specific patient-doctor interactions to really create a more personalized and really efficient care within each specific interaction?
Yeah, it's an interesting question in the context that I've seen in much written and much on television about, my goodness, are these machines going to replace man? Is this going to be the end of the human interface, and et cetera? And no more is that more important than in the area of medicine. And I know what I've seen because I've seen the doctors and how they interact. I believe actually this is an era where it will be an assistant to a fine doctor. and it will not interrupt the flow between he and his patient. It will enhance that, and I've watched how it works. And so marry that with the kinds of ways that all of us are used to digitally engaging without it being intrusive, and I see a doctor using it just as an aid, as he knows all of your tests, he knows the results, he knows your x-rays. Watson soon will have sight, not just reading ability. And then what he's gonna use, it's gonna guide his decision-making. And he'll use it as input, because doctors often, they form their hypothesis, they wanna test them. But you know, again, we just happen to be, because we've done all our work on cancer, it's not gonna take away from his intuition, what he sees in you, what your disposition is, the questions he talks to you about. If you have a certain kind of treatment, well, you don't want a treatment that you lose your hair, or you don't, you know, all of this is still so important. And so my observation when I've watched doctors work with Watson today, it's as if they're talking to a colleague, and it's a collaboration with a colleague in the way they interface. And that sometimes in front of or not in front of the patient, it doesn't matter really. It's to help in that decision making. And I think at this point you'll see it with very important decisions where when you're sick, you'd want to know, well, why was that the best? You know, because in addition to say this was a diagnosis, you could say, can you tell me what the evidence was? I mean, we're to the point where you're a very informed consumer, and we're entering a time with medicine where we need everyone to be informed consumers and make their choices. And so see what the evidence is, and it'll show you what evidence is. So I think it'll assist in that dialogue to let people take control of their health care. You do that much today already, but even more so, it'll be evidence-based healthcare, and you'll be able to take control and guide a lot of your own decisions, and with a doctor who, in fairness to doctors, who I have the utmost respect, but at the rate medical information, doubles every couple of years, they can't possibly keep up. A human can't keep up. So I think it's gonna bode for being sort of an assistant in that relationship, and it will empower actually the patient.
So we're about out of time, but let me pose one question. It probably is more directed at Sir Tim, but anyone here should comment if they would like. And it's a controversial one. It has to do with net neutrality. The question is, will internet fast lanes hinder data-driven innovation? Speak into the microphone.
Go for it.
Do you know what? So when you say net neutrality, I wonder whether
you can define it.
Probably not everybody knows what it means. Particularly because since it was defined and well defined, there's been a serious PR campaign by a particular industry sector to try to confuse the issue. Mm-hmm. And so people have been even, so the meme is, so net neutrality is that when you connect to the internet, if you connect to the internet, I connect to the internet, then you and I can communicate over the internet. If we buy slow speed, we can communicate slow speed. If we both buy high speed, we can communicate high speed, but it doesn't matter who we are. So the idea is that the internet does not discriminate either commercially or politically. Obviously, in different countries, in different scenarios, then you get different threats. In a lot of countries, in some it's you think it's the government, in some of it's the country, it's the companies. In a lot of them, like China and America, it's kind of the companies and the government can be quite closely coupled, and it's hard to distinguish, and it's hard to treat them as separate systems. So the idea is that obviously by the way, this neutral internet is the one we've had for 25 years mostly. There have been a few cases where, for example, a cable company as an internet service provider has slowed down Skype deliberately. It's just picked out the Skype packets because it hates the way Skype is taking away its telephone business. And actually, it's really, think of itself as a telephone company, it gets a lot more money when you pay for a landline. The fact that people can Skype is starting to undermine its landline. So it deliberately undermines Skype on the internet. Only once. Basically, that happened in Netherlands, and the net neutrality law went in, wham. You know, everybody's got a net neutrality law in their back pocket. A lot of countries have decided, Brazil, for example, passed this Marco Civil da Internet, which went through the Brazilian, both parts of the Brazilian parliament and was signed into law by President Dilma with a great speech. Look it up on the web on stage at the Net Mundial conference about internet governance the other day. So the EU has got a net neutrality provision. For me, the net neutrality is really, really important for innovation. It's the fact that I could write a web server and write a web browser as a piece of software, run these two pieces of software on two computers connected by the internet, and they could just communicate without me having to go to anybody central and ask permission, or having to go to my ISP and say, hey, I'm going to run stuff over a new port number. How much is that going to cost me? What's the deal going to be? That's been very, very important to innovation, and it has been very important to all the crazy things people have done on the internet since. So net neutrality is delivery of packets without discrimination, very important for innovation, very important for the market, the separate market of content and connectivity, and very important for democracy as well. For democracy, we must be able to go and look at see the world without our internet service provider providing filters to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's a question directed to Mary Claire and to Jenny. You know, both of you are global players, each in your own arenas. So what's been the most epiphanous or interesting experience that you've had internationally? Jenny?
Oh, boy, Shirley, I've been lucky to have so many. I would have to say, and of so many, perhaps it's most recent on my mind, one place I had never been until this past summertime was Israel. And of my travels, while we have quite a few people there, we've got almost 4,000 people there in a research lab as well, and no other IBM CEO had been there, while we were the first multinational to go into Israel when it became a state. Yeah, so I went, and I must say, for those, and maybe have many of you been, into the old city of Jerusalem, that was probably one of the most interesting experiences for me to see, while you have your own perceptions, but when you see what a small piece of land this is that we're speaking of, and the roots of all of so many parts of, the world that sit there from a religious perspective, and in a very small area called Old Jerusalem, which is divided into four corners between the Muslims, the Christians, etc. And the idea that these tiny, tiny quarters and that wars are fought over, and what the history tells you there, that's probably was one of the most interesting, while I know the history, to actually see it and experience it in that piece. And we'd had a dinner in a room, as the city is built on layer upon layer over centuries and millenniums of time, that was over 2,000 years old. And I think that gives you great perspective about the world and about mankind in a very small crucible that's there. And I'll always remember one of the meetings I had was with Shimon Peres, and obviously he's very old in his years at this time now, at 90, and many things, I was lucky, it was a good day, and he spent a couple hours, and I'll always remember one of the things he said, which was, he said, global companies have done more to develop countries than governments themselves because they see no boundaries. Mm-hmm. And there's truth to that.
There's truth to that.
Mary Claire?
Gosh, we did not set this up in advance. I'm going to take as an example a town just 10 miles south of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, where I've spent a lot of time in the past 20 years as part of a collaboration of Palestinian scientists and Israeli scientists and me, sorting out the genetics of inherited conditions in children in the region. And everything Ginny says about Jerusalem is absolutely true. There's something called the Jerusalem syndrome. When you first go there, there's this shock of suddenly having a fourth dimension to life, that the time dimension is with you always. And the challenges of moving from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, given the occupation, the political situation, the need for security on all sides, and then you think, damn it, Jesus walked. You know, this is some things change, and some things don't change, and some things change for the worse. And but the capacity, the reason it's epiphanic, is that the capacity of my Palestinian friends to be able to have created in this small and very fine, but very small university in Bethlehem, run by American Catholic brothers, called Bethlehem University, a first-class, world standard, NIH independently funded genomics laboratory that began in a closet. It's not a closet anymore, but in 1995 it was literally a closet, and we had to clear out the closet in order to clean it up and put in the first plumbing. And it's now a functioning lab with independent funding from multiple places. And the people doing this are, on the one hand, very isolated on many axes, but on the other hand, they have the internet, and they have friends on the internet. And their friends include people who live just 10 miles away, who see the world from the scientific perspective in the same way that they do, although they have very different worldviews historically. And the fact that these friends can collaborate with each other, communicating largely over the internet, they essentially don't see each other unless they're all in the US, has just worked wonders for capacity building in Palestine. And I commend Palestine to you as another place that IBM should put a research station, because there are young people in Palestine doing extremely good informatics work.
So there you have it. I think that's a good note to end on.
They're stretching. Stretching.
Oh, no. So.
My friend?
That was fun.
Yeah, good. Very clear. I got to give you a hug. Thank you.
That was great fun.
Em, I got to give you a hug, too.
Oh, very clear. You're a delight.
Oh, you too. You're terrific.
You've done so good for the
It
world,
would be
huh?
fabulous if we were in the Middle East at the same time.
Oh, yes, I tell you, that was real. What a funny thing we would end up on together, isn't it? I mean, you know.
Different places, you were too?
Yeah, and I was thinking, where am I?
There's no place like that immediate neighborhood.
Hard to describe it, isn't it?
Right.
Unless you go there. You think,
Right.
how can this be possible, right? And I remember seeing, I mean, the distance is like this and inflating, and the driver goes, oh, that's a Palestinian neighborhood. And you can tell those are Palestinian. And I thought, Mike, how could you tell? You see the houses, they're crooked. And I mean, just things that
They're poor, that's how you can tell.
in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I couldn't believe that.
Be careful, you might hit your
Oh,
mic.
yes,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Hello?
I'd like to say it in all the languages if you would.
So
Interaction
we're going to take a
was
quick
so
picture.
perfect that you think this was
We're so glad you liked it. We did not plan it ahead.
really.
Thank
May
you.
I
Okay.
ask you who the person is who has a 3-point